Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're going way back to the 1970s for the emergence of CLT.
Communicative Language Teaching.
Yes, CLT. And it's a big one. Definitely a topic that pretty much every TESOL student will have at least a little familiarity with.
Oh, for sure. A cornerstone, really.
Yeah, and we're going to approach it today with you pre-service TESOL teachers, specifically in mind.
Looking forward to it.
Okay, so let's imagine for a second a language classroom.
Okay.
Back in the 1960s.
All right.
What are we looking at? What's going on?
Rows and rows of students just drilling.
Drills. Like robots almost, right?
Exactly. It was all about structural approaches back then. So things like audiolingualism were really big.
Audiolingualism.
And it was all about getting those grammatical structures down pat through drills and repetition.
And I mean, I'm sure it worked for some learners.
Oh, for sure.
But it's pretty clear from where we are now that it wasn't really preparing them for the real world.
Yeah. I mean, learners could totally ace a grammar test, right? But when it came to actually using the language...
In real life.
Yeah, forget about it.
Total disconnect. And actually, that reminds me of something I read recently. It was talking about how language is like a bicycle.
Okay.
And if you just learn all the parts of a bicycle, but you never actually get on it and ride it.
You're not going to get very far, are you?
Exactly.
Love that.
So that's kind of where CLT comes in, right? Like in the 1970s, people were starting to realize this disconnect between how languages were being taught and how they were actually being used.
Exactly. It was like this big aha moment.
Yeah.
Like, we've been focusing on the wrong thing. Language isn't just this abstract system to be studied in isolation.
Right.
It's a tool for communication.
A tool to do things.
Yes, for achieving real-world goals. And that's the essence of CLT.
And in looking at our sources for today, I see that there were a few key factors that kind of sparked this whole CLT revolution.
Okay, let's hear it.
One of the big ones was a project by the Council of Europe.
Ah, yes. They were aiming to standardize language teaching across Europe.
Ambitious.
Very. And they wanted a framework that would really focus on the real-world needs of learners.
Makes sense.
Oh.
I mean, if you're trying to standardize something across so many different countries,
Yeah, you need a common ground.
you need something practical, something relevant.
And that's where people like David Wilkins came in.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading about him.
He had this great quote. What people want to do through language is more important than mastery of language as an unapplied system.
That's such a good quote. It really gets at the heart of CLT.
Doesn't it?
Like, stop worrying so much about the technical stuff, and let's get people actually using the language.
Exactly. Wilkins was all about organizing syllabuses around functions and notions.
Functions and notions.
So things like asking for directions, expressing opinions,
Making suggestions.
all those real-world things we do with language.
So instead of having units on, like, present simple,
Right.
you might have a unit on making requests. It seems so obvious now, but
It was a huge shift.
it really was.
A total reframing of how we think about language and its purpose.
And that's actually a perfect segue to the next big thing CLT brought to the table.
Hit me.
A whole new way of thinking about what language even is. Like, not just how to teach it,
Right.
but what it even is as a thing.
A big philosophical question.
And some pretty influential theories from linguistics started popping up around the same time,
Like what?
like communicative competence.
Ah, yes.
Dell Hymes.
Dell Hymes. Tell us more.
Well, he argued that simply knowing the rules of grammar, it's not enough.
It's not enough to be a competent speaker.
Nope. True competence.
Yeah.
It involves understanding how to use language appropriately in different social contexts.
Ooh, that's a good one. So like knowing when to be formal or informal,
Yes.
how to interrupt politely.
How to adjust your language depending on who you're talking to.
Yeah, it's all those little subtle social cues
Those unspoken rules.
that we often pick up just naturally in our native language. But that can be so tricky to learn in a second language.
And so the language teacher's job becomes so much bigger, right?
Absolutely. It's not just about grammar anymore.
You're not just a walking grammar textbook.
Nope. You're helping learners become culturally aware communicators.
And that's a really key takeaway for all of you pre-service teachers out there.
You're not just teaching a language. You're equipping learners with the tools to understand and participate in a whole new culture.
Wow. So CLT brought this fresh perspective on language and communication.
It did.
But I'm curious about the learning process itself. Like, how did CLT approach the question of how people actually learn languages?
Ooh, that's where things get really interesting. Early on, CLT actually didn't have a solid learning theory to back it up.
Really?
Yeah, some folks tried to sort of adapt techniques from older methods.
It's like taking those drills from audiolingualism?
Exactly, trying to make them more communicative.
But it wasn't really working.
Not really. It was like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. The underlying approach wasn't really aligned with CLT principles.
So what happened?
Well, luckily around this time, cognitivist theories started gaining traction.
Cognitivist theories. So this was a shift from seeing language learning as purely behavioral, right?
Exactly. It was a move away from just stimulus and response to understanding language learning as a cognitive process.
So like how learners process information,
Stored in memory.
retrieve it when they need to communicate.
All those amazing things our brains do.
Makes sense.
And so CLT started to embrace concepts like the skill-getting-skill-using framework,
Where learners first acquire knowledge and skills,
and then put them to use in communicative activities, kind of like learning the rules of a game first.
and then actually playing the game,
Precisely. So it became less about rote memorization.
and more about understanding how the brain actually acquires and uses language.
Exactly. But as all this was happening, some even more radical theories started to emerge. Theories that really pushed the boundaries of traditional language teaching. People like, all right, Krashen, Long, Swain,
Good names.
big ideas. They were all about learning by doing, creating immersive environments where language acquisition happens almost effortlessly.
So less emphasis on explicit grammar instruction and more focus on creating opportunities for real communication,
Yes. Think of Allright's minimal teaching strategy, for example.
where the teacher basically steps back and lets learners figure things out through tasks,
Exactly. Or Krashen's input hypothesis.
which emphasize the importance of comprehensible input.
So language that learners can understand, even if it's a little above their level.
So like watching movies, listening to music.
Having conversations with native speakers, all of that counts as valuable input.
I can.
And then you have Long's interaction hypothesis, which builds on that idea.
Okay.
He argued that negotiating for meaning is crucial for learning.
So when communication breaks down,
And you have to ask for clarification.
paraphrase,
Use gestures,
all those strategies we use to make sense of language, that's when the real learning happens.
according to Long, yes. And then we can't forget Swain's output hypothesis.
Tell me more.
Well, she argued that actually producing language,
Even making mistakes.
yes, forces learners to notice those gaps in their knowledge and try to improve.
But all sounds very metacognitive.
Very much so.
So we have this whole spectrum of theories now, right?
We do.
From those emphasizing explicit instruction.
To those favoring a more hands-off experiential approach.
And I imagine all of that led to some pretty different interpretations of what CLT actually looked like in the classroom.
Oh, absolutely. And that's something we'll dive into next time.
Can't wait.
Yeah.
All right, so last time we were talking about all these exciting different learning theories, some more structured and some really diving into authentic communication.
Yeah, and how do we actually put those into practice? How do we make a CLT syllabus? That's the challenge.
Right, because we touched on that idea of functional-notional syllabuses before the break, organizing things around what learners can do with language.
Like making requests.
Expressing opinions.
Yeah.
Instead of grammatical structure.
Exactly. Sounds simple, right? But it wasn't quite that straightforward.
No. What was the problem?
Well, functions and notions, they're slippery little things.
I see what you mean.
You can't really pin them down.
Unlike grammar structures.
Which usually have pretty clear rules.
Right. Subject to verb object.
Exactly. You know where you stand. But functions, they really depend on the context.
So like saying making a request is more complex than expressing an opinion.
Right. It's impossible to say which is harder.
Because it depends on the situation.
Who you're talking to.
All those subtle things.
And so trying to sequence them in a syllabus
Ooh, that's a problem.
became really difficult. A lot of textbooks that claim to be communicative, they actually fell back on grammar anyway.
So they kind of hedged their bets.
They did. Communicative in principle.
But still relying on that familiar grammar structure.
It was a compromise.
Which brings us to the big question.
Hit me.
How much grammar do we really need in CLT?
Ooh, yeah. That's the million-dollar question.
Still sparks debates.
All the time.
Some people say if you focus too much on communication,
You might end up with learners who are fluent,
but not accurate.
making tons of mistakes.
Right, and that's a valid concern.
For sure. Accuracy is important. But we don't want to go back to those dry grammar lessons either.
No, we don't want to suck all the life out of it.
Exactly. So it's about finding that sweet spot, that balance.
Form and function in harmony.
I like it.
Working together.
And that's where a skilled teacher can really make a difference.
By creating an environment that blends it all together seamlessly.
Seamlessly. Explicit grammar when it's needed.
Plenty of chances for real communication.
And being responsive to the needs of different learners. Because not everyone learns the same way.
Right. Some learners might need more explicit instruction.
Some might thrive in a more immersive environment.
It's all about knowing your students.
And knowing yourself as a teacher.
What works for you?
Exactly. And this leads us to another critique of CLT.
Ooh, tell me.
The question of cultural appropriateness.
Because CLT emerged in a very specific context.
Yeah, it did. Western Europe and North America.
And those values, like learner-centeredness,
Individual expression.
fluency over accuracy.
Might not resonate everywhere.
Right. Think about the role of the teacher.
Okay.
In some cultures, the teacher is the authority.
The source of knowledge. Students listen respectfully.
And that clashes with CLT's focus on student-centered learning.
Big time. Where learners are encouraged to participate.
Express their opinions.
Even challenge the teacher.
So that's a real dilemma, right?
It is, because it's not just about respecting different cultures.
It's about understanding that different learners learn differently.
Exactly. What motivates one might demotivate another. So how do we deal with this complexity?
Yeah, do we abandon CLT if it doesn't fit?
I don't think so. Even the biggest critics of CLT, they're not saying we should go back to purely structural methods.
Right. Nobody's arguing for that.
No. So for me, it's about being thoughtful.
Being critical.
Taking the best of what CLT has to offer.
And adapting it
To your context.
to your learns.
Your own teaching style. See CLT as a set of principles.
Not a strict rule book.
Exactly. You might need to adapt activities, adjust your style, even borrow from other approaches.
It's all about being flexible,
Responsive.
finding what works.
And speaking of things that need to be adapted, let's talk textbooks.
Ah, yes, those trusty companions.
They really reflect the evolution of CLT.
How so?
Well, if we go back to those early days, there were some really cool attempts to create truly communicative textbooks.
Like strategies?
Yeah. They really emphasized learner interaction.
Activities that mimicked real-world communication.
It was groundbreaking at the time.
It was.
They introduced all these new activity types, authentic materials, and encouraged a more facilitative role for the teacher.
But then CLT started facing those criticisms we talked about.
Mm-hmm.
And the textbooks started to change too,
They did. Some became more balanced,
incorporating both communicative activities.
and a solid grammar syllabus.
So it was like a hybrid approach.
Exactly. Appealing to a wider range of teachers, those who weren't quite ready to go full-on communicative.
But still wanted to try some new things.
And one of the most successful textbook series,
Headway.
Headway. They did promote communicative methodology in the early editions,
But they also really emphasized grammar.
which a lot of teachers appreciated.
That familiar structure.
But here's the interesting thing. Headway, like a lot of textbooks,
Yeah.
they've actually become even more grammar-focused in recent editions.
Interesting.
It's like the pendulum is swinging back a bit.
Back to grammar.
Maybe.
Yeah.
There's definitely a renewed emphasis on explicit grammar instruction.
Even within a communicative framework.
It's a reminder that CLT is not static.
It's always evolving,
Pendulum.
responding to new research, new challenges.
Exactly. And that's why it's so crucial for you as pre-service teachers to be critical of textbooks. Don't just blindly follow them.
Yeah.
Analyze them.
Adapt them.
Supplement them with your own knowledge and creativity.
Because the textbook is just one tool.
One piece of the puzzle.
We need to bring our own understanding of our learners.
Our ability to create that dynamic learning environment.
And our passion for teaching.
That's what really makes a difference.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground with CLT, haven't we?
We have. Origins, theories, criticisms,
Textbooks.
the whole shebang.
And now I think it's time to ask the big question.
Okay, shoot.
What impact has CLT really had?
On language teaching,
Yeah. Has it lived up to the hype?
the revolutionary promise.
Has it fundamentally changed how we think about teaching languages?
That's a tough one, because like we said before, there's often a disconnect between theory and practice.
Right. All those real-world constraints,
Like huge classes,
limited resources.
standardized tests.
Sometimes it feels like we're swimming upstream.
It can. But even so,
Yeah.
I do think CLT has left its mark.
In what way?
It's shifted how we view language,
Yeah.
a static system of rules, a dynamic tool for communication,
Ooh.
for connecting with others.
For navigating the world.
It's not just about grammar anymore.
It's about using language to do things.
To achieve goals.
To express your...
To build relationships.
And that's a pretty powerful legacy.
It is. And we also can't forget all the practical tools that CLT gave us.
Ooh. Yeah. Like what?
All those information gap tasks.
Role plays.
Reiteration.
Using authentic materials.
Things that a lot of teachers use without even thinking about it.
And those are engaging.
They are.
They really get learners using language.
Purpose.
It's not just memorizing rules.
Exactly. So even if the label CLT fades away, those core principles,
focusing on communication,
putting learners first,
creating engaging experiences,
those will endure.
So as future teachers,
you're inheriting all of that.
That's exciting.
It is.
But also kind of daunting.
How so?
Because how do we carry that torch forward? The world's changing so fast.
It is. That's where the real learning begins.
Okay. I'm listening.
You have to be a critical thinker. Question your assumptions. Reflect on what you do.
Stay up to date.
Exactly. It's not enough to just learn about CLT in your TESOL program.
It's an ongoing process.
It is. You have to keep learning.
Keep growing.
Keep adapting.
And be open to new ideas.
Try new things.
And most importantly,
listen to your students.
Because in the end, it's all about them, isn't it?
It is.
Helping them discover the power of language.
To connect.
To make their voices heard.
And as you all head out into your classroom,
remember the incredible opportunity you have
to make a difference.
To help your students unlock the potential of language.
That's a great note to end on.
I think so.
So to all of you listening out there,
embrace the spirit of CLT.
Adapt it to your context.
And never stop learning. And who knows, maybe you'll be the ones to start the next revolution in language teaching.
Now, wouldn't that be something?
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into CLT for today.
Thanks for joining us.
We'll see you next time for another exciting journey into the world of language learning.